Well, good evening. I'm going to scoot this back just a little bit here if you don't mind. I want to let you know that tonight we're going to be looking at one of my absolute favorite stories in David's life. This story has it all, or so it promises to have it all at least. At the end of the day, I guess that this story doesn't quite live up to the promised type of the early verses that it has. But I think that what's so great about this story that we're looking at is just that. It doesn't escalate the way that we expect it to. David is going to have two choices tonight. And what he chooses will make all the difference, not just for today, but for his entire kingship. David has two choices, and he's going to have to hurry up and make up his mind. So, people have often been intrigued by the idea of internal struggle. We have coined phrases like the battle within, or maybe you've heard, I'm my own worst enemy, to try and capture the internal conflict that we feel about making choices. My head tells me to go, but my heart tells me to say, and maybe a gifted songwriter would write. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. A poet may scribble down, even if he does lie in the end about which one he chose, for all of you English majors. Our culture has tried, like others, to create imagery that depicts this internal bout. And my favorite representation of inner turmoil is this one that Stephen's about to show you. Now, you may recognize this character. This is Kronk from Disney's The Emperor's New Groove. I watched this movie quite a lot as a young child. It's one of the best Disney films that has ever been made, and I will convince you that you are wrong if you disagree with me. You can see me after service about that. But probably my favorite character in this entire movie is the one you see there, the guy in the middle, Kronk. As you can see here, Kronk is very familiar with the warring factions that go on within one's mind. You can see on one side we have Kronk's angel, and on the other side we have Devil Kronk. Now, these characters are dressed exactly like him, or they're not dressed like him, they look like him, they're dressed a little bit different. But you can see that this is what Kronk is having going on in his mind. Now, when Kronk, who is not the smartest character in the movie, has a choice to make, these two little characters appear on his shoulders, and they coach him in what choice they think he should make. Now, as you can imagine, the angel often urges him to make the right choice, while the little devil on his other shoulder tells him to commit to chaos of sorts. Now, the end result is usually that Kronk has heard both of these little characters talk to him, and he is no closer to making a choice than he was before they started. Now, this is just a comedic way of showing how things often go inside of our brains. Now, I think a ton of us have felt torn between two options before and have wondered which way we should go. Now, often our choices are, in fact, right before us. Sometimes two physical roads on an interstate, or maybe two different outfits hanging up in a closet. Now, in our story tonight from David's life, David will find himself in a Kronk-like situation here. His options, although he is deciding internally what to do, are in fact fleshed out before him. Two people that we will meet tonight in David's story serve as foils for the choice that David has to make. So let's go ahead and read a little bit of this story together tonight and see if we can figure out who is who in our story. We'll be starting in 1 Samuel chapter 25 in verse 1. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep at Carmel. And now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. Now David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes. For we come on a feast day. Please give us whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." We see that this story takes place while David is still on the run from Saul. In fact, this is recorded between the two different stories that Stephen talked about last week, the two occasions of David sparing Saul's life. But right here at the beginning of the story, we are introduced to two people. They are husband and wife. Their family is very rich, but they are nothing alike. The man, Nabal, is described as harsh and badly behaved. The Hebrew there is literally evil. He's not a good guy. The woman, Abigail, is both intelligent and beautiful. Those are very different descriptions given in very close proximity, and those descriptions will be important to remember as our story moves on. Now, the text tells us that David and his men had been with Nabal's shepherds in the wilderness. It is now time for them to shear the sheep, and Nabal has quite a lot of them, 3,000 sheep to be exact. Now, the shearing time in the ancient world was a time of celebration. There was often a feast, and all who had taken part in this process, whether the shepherds or the shearers or the one who owns it all, would be called together to share of that great wealth that they were about to bring in. So David sends his men to Nabal, and really he asks for just the scraps. He literally tells his men to ask for whatever extra Nabal can share, whatever he just happens to have. And he does this with the hope that Nabal will be generous. But we already know what kind of a man Nabal is. If you missed it the first time, then the text is about to remind you. When David's young men came, they said all of this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I don't know where?" So David's young men turned away, and they came back and told David all this. And David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. Now David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. Now David's men come to Nabal, hoping to be given a gift, and all Nabal gives them is a lashing. He acts like he does not know who David is, at least at first. But the fact that he uses the son of Jesse to describe David suggests that he does know him. In fact, that same term is the one that Saul will use when he's talking about David, and he means it in a negative way. Not only that, but Nabal accuses David of being a slave who has broken away from his master. And he suggests that David is not worth his time. He's not going to send any of his supplies. He says that he won't give his supplies that his shearers deserve to these men who come from, well, he doesn't know where they come from, he says. Now, in a word, Nabal is a troublemaker. He could have politely declined David's request. He could have sent very little back and said, "Sorry, David, this is all that I could spare for you." But instead, he takes the time to insult David, suggest that David is a rebel against Saul, and act as if it may not be noble, that David might not be a very good character to send these supplies off with. These strange men who have come to visit him might not be so trustworthy, Nabal seems to suggest. Now, you know David. We've been studying David for the last few weeks. How do you think that David is going to respond to this? Well, how would any of us respond to this? David says, "Strap on your swords, boys. We're going to take care of this." He's going to go and get his revenge. And who could blame him? Nabal has repaid David's good, the good that David and his men had done, with evil. David wants justice. Now back at Wayne Manor, Abigail is hearing about what Nabal has told David's men. The word the servant uses to tell Abigail about what Nabal had done to them is the same word in the Hebrew that is used to describe a bird of prey like an eagle or a hawk jumping down on its next victim. This is what the text tells us that Nabal has done to David's servants. It was brutal. And the servant tells Abigail that the men were in fact telling the truth, that they had been with Nabal's shepherds in the wilderness, and that they had protected the flock. They had even made a wall around the flock and the shepherds while they slept so that no intruders would get in. And never once did they take any of Nabal's sheep as payment for their services. The servant tells all these things to Abigail, and he says, "Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house. And he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him." David's going to be upset, and the servants of the house know that. Everyone knows that David is going to retaliate, but no one can talk to Nabal about it because he is so worthless. Now that's the text word. That's not mine. I'm not the one throwing punches. It's all right there. Abigail must have found herself in some similar situations to this quite often because she knows what to do right away. She gathers up a small but sufficient gift for David, he and his men, and she takes off down the road in hopes of coming across David before he reaches Nabal's house. She sends the young men out before her and leaves without telling her husband. And the text says that as she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her. And she met them. Now David had said this, "Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him. He has returned me evil for good. Now God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." We get a little bit of insight into the conversation that's going on inside of David's head here on David's shoulders. Nabal's voice is the only one that David hears right now. He cannot believe that all the good that he did has just been repaid in such an evil way. To have his honor questioned and his men left hungry. But the text tells us that Abigail is about to happen upon David. And the way that the text translates her journey may obscure what is meant here. It says in the ESV, and that's what I'm reading from tonight, that she came down under the cover of the mountain. Literally, it says something like she came across the sacred way. What it means here in the text is that David and his men and Abigail are coming towards each other, but they can't see that they're on the same path. It's like they're coming down from around different sides of the mountain and they're about to meet. It makes it appear as if it is a coincidence. It's not something that she chased after him. But rather than coincidence, we'll see in this story that it was in fact providential. David had been chatting with his inner devil, plotting his revenge. But that other shoulder of David's is about to be occupied. Verse 23 says that when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey, and she fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil shall not be found in you as long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord, according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt with my Lord, then remember your servant." That's a lot of text, and there's a lot of different Lord going on there, the Lord David and the Lord God. But let's talk about it a little bit here. Abigail comes to David, and she apologizes right away for her husband's behavior. His name means fool, she tells David. So he needs not be taken seriously. That's all that he is. And here Abigail does three things to try and bring David back to reality as the one who occupies his other shoulder. One, she reminds him who he is. She bows down when she meets him. She recognizes him as the anointed one of God. She reminds him that he is to be the king of Israel. And that's important. Now, she doesn't directly tell him to shape up. Abigail is too clever to be that direct. But she reminds him of his position. Murdering every citizen who insults you, David, is not a very good way to go about being king. Number 2, Abigail reminds David of his God. Abigail makes it clear to David that God has caused them to meet on this road. And by doing so, God has saved David from sin, from blood guilt, and saving with his own hand. God has provided for David by sending Abigail to him to soften his mind. And number 3, and this is, I think, the most important one of all, Abigail reminds David of what God is going to do for him. She reminds him that God will make his house sure. She reminds David that he has been called to fight the Lord's battles, like he did against Goliath. And she tells David that God will protect him and defeat his enemies, and that he will make David king. And on that day, Abigail assures David, you will be glad that you did not work salvation by your own hand. You will be glad that you chose not to fight your own battles. God will lift you up, and he will fight them for you. David has an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. The one is urging him to act recklessly. The other is pleading with him to be patient. The devil is provoking him to fight for his own honor, while the angel is begging him to hold up God's. Now, David has 2 voices in his head, the voice of Nabal and the voice of Abigail. And David must choose what he will do. And more than just the voices in his head, David has 2 paths before him, aptly named in this case. He can choose the path of Nabal. Now, Nabal, it tells us, means fool, but it also can mean in Hebrew the embarrassment of the father. David can choose to act like a fool, to run to Carmel, guns ablazing, and to deal with Nabal as he sees fit. He can choose the path of Nabal, or he can choose the path of Abigail. Now, Abigail means something very different. It means the joy of the father. David can choose to relent. He can choose to leave Nabal be and to fight the battles of the Lord. But ultimately, it is David's choice to make. Which person that stands before him will David choose to emulate? Embarrassment or joy? Abigail has brought the provisions. She has given David what he had initially requested, after all. So the only outstanding conflict is the one that David has to resolve in himself. Now, either way, David's decision will affect God, his father, and David seems to realize that. David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to me this day. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." Now David received from her hand what she had brought, and he said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." David wakes from his Kronk-like daydream just in time to make the right decision in this story. He recognizes that Abigail has saved him from himself. He admits that he would have committed sin had she not intervened. And David greatly takes her gift, and he lets her go. "You have kept me this day from working salvation with my own hands." David sees that the choice that he had was not just about good and evil and repaying good and evil. It was about whether David would choose to be an Nabal or to be an Abigail. And he did so quite literally. David chose Abigail. Abigail returns home to find her husband Nabal drunk and passed out. Sounds like a wonderful husband. And so she decides to wait until he is sober to deal with him. Now, when Nabal wakes up, Abigail tells him of what she did in going to David, and Nabal doesn't fall back asleep, but it says that his heart stopped and he turned as if he were stone. We don't know exactly what happens, but 10 days later, it says that the Lord struck Nabal and he was dead. Now when David hears of it, this is what he says. Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. David then sends for Abigail and he asks her to be his wife. She clearly impressed David. David's found wisdom personified in her, and he doesn't want to follow the fool's way any longer. And that's the end of that story. In church, I've got to tell you, I think that we have, still even today, a lot of voices competing for our time, speaking into our lives. I think that all of us that have conversations or have had conversations with the little people on our shoulders. And what's more, I think that like David, we have seen them stand before us and implore us to make a choice. And those choices are the same for us in most cases that they were for David. We can choose the fool's way, or we can choose the path of wisdom. We can choose to be an embarrassment or to be a joy. And it's hard. It is hard to resist the urge to try and work salvation with our own hands. When somebody repays your good with evil, it is hard not to fall into their own foolery. And those things that Abigail told David, what she reminded him of? Nabal tells us those very same things. He tells us who we are, he tells us who God is, and he tells us what God will or will not do for us in the future. His answers are just a little bit different. Nabal tells you today that you are nobody, that your past defines you, that you're just a son or a daughter of whomever, and that is all that you will ever be. Nabal tells you that God has not anointed you. He tells you that you are just a runaway slave from your real masters of sin and death, and that no one will ever support you or help you out of it. He tells you that God will not provide. Nabal says that God has done nothing for you, and He will continue to do so. He says that you will only get as far in life as you are willing to take yourself, because no one is going to work salvation out for you. You have to take it with your own hands. But here stands Abigail. Abigail, like she did for David, reminds you that you are a child of God. She tells you that you have been called to fight the battles of the Lord. Abigail reminds you that God has brought you this far and that He is actively working to strengthen you so that you will not fall into sin, so that He can keep you from sin and death. Abigail points to those who have gone on before you, and she asks you to open your eyes and see what it is that God is doing and what He will do in the future. She sees that God has started a work in you that He is yet to finish, but that when He does finish it, you will have a place with Him that cannot be taken away from you in His kingdom. Abigail knows that it is God who works salvation, and she urges us to be patient as we wait for Him to do so. Well, what will you choose? Will you listen to Nabal tonight? Will you seek vengeance and provoke others and do what you think is right in your own mind? It'll lead to the embarrassment of the one who calls himself your father. Or will you listen to Abigail? Will you seek peace and build others up and fight the battles of the Lord? These things bring joy to the one who has called us from darkness into His marvelous light. And I know it sounds so easy when I stand up here and say it like that, doesn't it? It sounds like all you have to do is just listen to the little angel on your shoulder instead of the little devil. We all know that it's not that simple in life. We know that it is hard to tell which battles are the Lord's and which battles are really just about me. We know that sometimes it's not just an internal war, but a physical one that we fight, where actual people stand before us, and we still have to make those choices. I'm not going to say that I've got it all figured out tonight. I won't stand up here and act like this isn't something that I struggle with as well. But I want to offer 2 words of advice, and then I'll leave the lesson to you. First, when it's hard to know if you're fighting for yourself or fighting the Lord's battles, ask yourself, can I fight this battle from a position of humility? This is a truth that I think David learned in his life. David writes in Psalm 25, "Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right, and he teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. God can take the sinner and transform him. He can lead him to fight the Lord's battles, but it takes a humble spirit. God leads the humble in what is right. God teaches the humble, it says, his way. It's the way of steadfast love and faithfulness. And if we are fighting a battle that requires anything more than humility, then it is a battle that is not really God's. It's ours. God fights our battles, but he's only able to do so if we put down our swords and fight for him. We fight for the honor of God, church, and not for our own honor, not for ourselves. And second, I pray that we remind ourselves of three things whenever we need to make a choice, whether or not we're going to enter the battlefield. We remind ourselves of who we are, of who God is, and of what he has promised to do, just like Abigail reminded David tonight. Remind yourself that you are a child of God, called to walk this earth as new creation. Remind yourself that God is your Father and that he loves you very much, and he has provided for you. Remind yourself that God has promised that he will work salvation and that he will give you rest, the rest that you so desire. And if you can remember those things and still make the choice that you're thinking about making, then you're probably fighting the Lord's battles. And if not, you may want to reconsider your actions. You know, David teaches us a good lesson tonight, that it is never too late to back out of a bad oath or a bad promise or a bad deal. I pray not only that we all choose the path of Abigail this week, but that God would put us on the shoulders of others. I pray that we can build each other up in that path of wisdom and help each other to walk in a way that brings joy to our Lord. May your voice, the one that others hear when they think of you, be a holy and joyful sound this week to all those who would hear it. Remind others of who they are or who they could be in Christ, of who our God is and what he has done, and of what he has promised to do with our enemies, our true enemies, sin and death. He will defeat them. Now, if you need to respond tonight, we want to let you know that we're here for you. We're here to support you if you want to be baptized into Christ. We're here to help you, whether you're going through good times or bad times. If you need to make any petition to our God tonight, then we as a church would be glad to be here and stand with you as we stand and sing.